All right, folks, buckle up. Today, we're stepping into the world of biologics manufacturing.
Which, let me tell you, is a pretty fascinating world.
It really is. I mean, it's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. We're talking about creating these incredibly complex, life-saving drugs from living organisms.
It's like we're taking a page from nature's playbook.
Exactly. We're basically hacking nature's code to create treatments that can make a real difference in people's lives. And that's what we're diving deep on today, not just the science behind these drugs, but what it actually takes to design and build a facility to manufacture them.
And let me tell you, it's a whole lot more complicated than just throwing up a building and saying, get to work.
Right. It's not your average factory.
Yeah.
So what kind of blueprint are we working with today to guide us through this deep dive?
We've got our hands on a technical document, a real treasure trove of information that outlines the ins and outs of a biologics bulk drug manufacturing facility. Think of it as a behind-the-scenes pass to a high-tech world where science meets engineering.
It's like a combination of a super high-tech lab and a living, breathing organism all rolled into one.
You got it. And to really understand how these facilities work, we need to start at the very beginning of the process with something called cell banking.
Okay, so when I hear cell banking, I'm picturing something like a vault where they keep the master copies of these cells. Am I on the right track?
You're spot on. It's a highly secure area where they store what we call the master and working cell banks. These banks hold the precious blueprints for our biologic drugs. It's like a library of life, if you will.
Wow, it's amazing to think that a tiny vial, smaller than my thumb, could hold the potential for so much healing. So what happens when you're ready to actually start producing a drug? Do you just hit the defrost button on these cell banks?
It's a bit more complicated than that, but you've got the right idea. We start by thawing a vial, very carefully, of course, to make sure the cells wake up happy and healthy, ready to get to work.
I bet they need a good cup of coffee, just like the rest of us.
Something like that. But seriously, once we've got our cells up and running, the next step is all about expanding those cells, growing them in larger and larger containers as we move through the process.
So it's like a delicate dance, nurturing those cells along the way and making sure they have everything they need to thrive.
Exactly. We start small with shike flasks, which are kind of like the starter homes for our cells.
Got it.
And then, as they grow and multiply, we gradually move them into larger bioreactors. Think of these bioreactors as those fancy high-rise apartments for our microscopic friends.
I can picture it now, but I imagine these bioreactors are anything but ordinary apartments. What's so special about them?
They're specially designed to create the ideal environment for cell growth and protein production. And as we move through the different stages of the bioreactors, what we call the end stages, the cell density increases, meaning there are more and more cells in the same amount of space. It's like a city that keeps growing upwards.
And I bet things get really interesting once we reach the penthouse suite of this cellular city, right? What's so special about the end stage?
You could say that. The end stage is where the cells are at their most productive, churning out the desired protein at peak efficiency. It's a critical phase that requires constant monitoring, like a team of engineers making sure all the systems are running smoothly.
So we've got our cells multiplying, working hard to create the protein we need. What happens next? Do we just scoop out the protein and call it a day?
Not quite. It's time for harvesting, which basically means separating the protein we're after from the cells themselves and all the other stuff they've been growing in.
So it's like separating the wheat from the chaff, making sure we're left with the good stuff.
You got it. It's a delicate process, like sifting for gold, and it paves the way for the next crucial stage, downstream processing.
And that, my friends, is where we'll pick up next time. Downstream processing. It sounds kind of like we're entering the spa portion of this whole operation. Are we giving these proteins a cucumber mask and a massage, or what?
Well, not quite a spa treatment, but yeah, I guess you could think of it as a high-tech cleaning and polishing process.
Okay, I'm intrigued. So we've got our protein, we've harvested it from the cells, but it's not exactly ready to be bottled up and shipped off just yet, right?
Exactly. It's surrounded by a lot of other stuff, impurities, leftovers from the cell culture media, you name it. Downstream processing is all about getting rid of all that extra baggage and making sure we're left with a highly purified, safe, and effective medicine.
It reminds me of those old gold rush movies where they're panning for gold, sifting through all the dirt and gravel to find those little nuggets of gold. Is that kind of what we're doing here, but with proteins?
That's actually a pretty good analogy. And just like in gold panning, where they use different techniques to separate the gold from everything else, we use a variety of methods in downstream processing. And one of the key players in our toolbox is something called chromatography.
Chromatography. I've heard that term thrown around before, but it always seemed a bit intimidating, to be honest. Can you break it down for me, what's actually happening during chromatography?
So imagine you have a jar full of different colored marbles, all mixed up, and you want to separate them by color. Chromatography works in a similar way, but instead of separating by color, we're separating proteins based on their unique properties, things like their size, their charge, or even their affinity to bind to certain molecules.
Okay, that makes sense. So instead of picking out marbles, we're isolating our target protein from the mix.
Yeah.
But what do these protein sorters actually look like? Are we talking about some kind of microscopic sieve?
It's a bit more high-tech than a kitchen sieve, unfortunately. We use these specialized columns filled with materials that act as our filters.
I see.
And depending on what we're trying to achieve, we use different types of chromatography. For example, there's something called affinity chromatography, where we use columns filled with materials that act like molecular Velcro. They're designed to grab onto our target protein while letting everything else pass through.
It's like a targeted capture mission. So we're basically fishing out our protein of interest.
Cool.
You mentioned other characteristics too, like size and charge. How did those come into play?
You got it. Each of those characteristics helps us further purify our protein. So after we've done affinity chromatography, we often move on to something called ion exchange chromatography, which is a mouthful, I know, but it's a really neat process.
Lay it on me.
Basically, we're using the charges of molecules to our advantage. We use these columns filled with materials that have either a positive or negative charge, and they act like little magnets, attracting and binding proteins that have the opposite charge.
So if our target protein has a negative charge, we'd use a positively charged column to attract it and separate it from everything else. It's like a microscopic game of opposites attract.
You got it. And then there's size exclusion chromatography, which, as the name suggests, separates proteins based on their size. Think of it like pouring our protein mixture through a series of progressively smaller mesh screens.
So the smaller proteins get caught in the finer meshes while the bigger ones pass through.
Exactly. It's all about using these different techniques to purify our protein to the highest possible level. But of course, we can't forget about safety.
Absolutely not. Especially when we're talking about medications that will be going into people's bodies. What steps are taken to ensure that the final product is safe?
Well, one of the most critical steps is viral filtration. It's like our final line of defense, making sure our drug product is free from any potential viral contaminants.
So we filtered out the impurities, we've separated and purified our protein, and we've given it a clean bill of health. Are we ready to start bottling this liquid gold?
Almost there. You see, even though we've purified our protein, it's often still too dilute. It's like having a really weak cup of coffee. So we need to concentrate it, and that's where tangential flow filtration, or TFF for short, comes in.
TFF, another acronym for the books. So how does this TFF work its magic?
Imagine using a special type of coffee filter to make cold brew coffee more concentrated. That's kind of what TFF does. It uses a membrane, our special filter, to separate the water from the protein, effectively concentrating it to the desired level.
Okay, so it's like squeezing out the excess water to make a more potent protein solution. So after this final concentration step, what do we have? Are we looking at the final drug product?
We're getting close. What we have now is called the bulk drug substance. It's essentially a concentrated, purified solution of our target protein, the heart of the final medication.
It's incredible to think that we've gone from a tiny vial of frozen cells to this purified, concentrated protein solution, all thanks to this amazing, intricate process. But I have to ask, where does all of this happen? What kind of facility can handle all this high-tech sorting and purifying?
That's a great question. Now that we've walked through the journey of the drug itself, let's zoom out a bit and step inside the facility where all the magic happens.
We always like to start at the beginning, right?
Yeah.
In this case, it's what's called the upstream process, or USP for short. This is where it all starts, yeah.
It is. Think of a biopharmaceutical, right? Like a really complex machine. So the upstream process is kind of where you manufacture each little part. And it all starts with like specific cell lines. They're chosen because they can produce certain therapeutic proteins.
Gotcha. Okay, so our blueprint here, it mentions cell banking right off the bat. What is that all about? Like, why is it so important?
Well, imagine this. You lose the master recipe for, like, a genuinely life-saving drug?
Oh.
Right. That's bad. And that's what cell banking is protecting against. You're basically storing master copies of these cell lines, often frozen, to make sure there's always a secure supply, for the future.
So it's kind of like the Fort Knox of biopharmaceuticals. Super high security, make sure nothing happens to these, what did you call them? Cell lines.
Yeah, cell lines. And they are delicate. I mean, keeping them viable is a huge deal.
Makes sense.
So as we go through this blueprint, we see things like solution preparation, then material handling, equipment storage, all these little things, but they all matter.
It's kind of mind-boggling when you think about it, the level of coordination involved, even at this early stage.
Yeah.
Everything has to be meticulously prepped and ready to go, kind of like a really high-stakes science experiment or something.
Right. And speaking of high stakes, we get to the reactor hall. It's like the heart of the whole upstream process.
Sounds kind of intimidating, not gonna lie. What exactly is happening in there?
So this is where those cells, the ones we talked about that have been, carefully grown and cultivated, they finally multiply. And in the process, they produce the proteins that, we're aiming for.
Okay.
Think massive, totally sterile vessels with the temperature and pressure and nutrients all precisely controlled. It is a delicate, delicate dance.
I bet. And I imagine even the tiniest speck of contamination in there would be a disaster, right?
100%. Every single step here is about absolute sterility, which, looking at this blueprint, it even mentions washing. There's in-process testing. They call it IPTUS. And then there's this thing, a MOF ballroom. It sounds so weird.
MOF ballroom. What could that even, is that adding some specific ingredient or?
It has to be, right? Huh.
And all of this, that's still considered upstream. It seems like so much happens before we even get to, an actual drug.
Well, remember, we're still talking about the raw materials here. Think of it like harvesting grapes for a really nice wine.
Yeah.
You wouldn't just drink the grape juice straight.
Yeah.
You need that refining process, and that's where the downstream process, or DSP, comes in.
Okay, so upstream is like creation then, and downstream is all about purification.
Exactly. If you look here, the blueprint, it lists this whole journey. Centrifuge room, filter room, column packing. It's all about separating and purifying that target protein from, everything else in that cell culture mix.
Okay, so I'm kind of getting this. Centrifugation, that's like your high-speed spin cycle.
Right.
Filtration, that's basically acting like a microscopic sieve.
Yeah.
But what about this column packing thing? What even is that?
Picture this, a vertical tube filled with this special material.
Okay.
When that mix flows through it, right, different components, they stick to the material at different rates so we can separate them out, like this really, really precise sorting system.
That's really neat.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, so then we come to post-viral purification, which I'm guessing is very, very important.
Understatement. Any viral contamination, even a tiny amount, could be incredibly dangerous. This stage is all about making sure that final product is completely safe.
Wow. It's kind of amazing when you think about it, how much thought goes into literally every single step of this.
Yeah.
Because, we are talking about medicines here, life-saving therapies. Even the tiniest mistake could have huge consequences.
Yeah. And it's not over yet, even after all that. Look, we've got that MOF ballroom showing up again. My guess, final formulation happens in there.
Interesting.
And then there's INQC prep, the logistic corridor, and even IPTDS. There are quality control checkpoints at every stage here. It's really impressive.
This blueprint really drives home just how complex this whole operation is.
It is.
But it's not just about actually making this stuff, is it? What about all the behind-the-scenes support?
Of course not. There's a whole section in here dedicated to storage and support areas, and even that's super detailed. Look, ML, material airlock. Can't have contamination.
So is that how they guarantee a sterile environment in those critical areas?
Pretty much, yeah, like an airlock on a spaceship. Keeps the bad stuff out. And then you've got your controlled room temperature areas. Then even more specific, cold storage, like a dedicated cold room, and even a freeze walk-in.
Makes sense. I'm guessing temperature control is super important for these types of, what they call them, biologics.
Absolutely. If the temperature fluctuates even a little, it can be really bad. Consistent temperature throughout the whole process, that's vital.
Of course, we can't forget labs. No high-tech facility would be complete without them. And this blueprint, it lists them all. QC labs, process development labs, even personnel facilities, which is nice.
Right, because at the end of the day, there are still actual people behind all this incredibly complex tech. They're the ones making sure it all runs smoothly.
Honestly, it's kind of mind-boggling when you think about it, the level of coordination across all these different areas.
It really is. It's a true testament to human ingenuity, like a perfectly orchestrated symphony of science and engineering, you know. There's one more thing I'd like to highlight. It's easy to overlook, but it's so crucial. The technical floors. They're kind of like the unsung heroes of the whole operation.
Oh yeah, they were mentioned briefly. What exactly are they, and what makes them so important?
Think of them as the behind-the-scenes crew. You don't see them on stage, but they make the whole show possible. Technical floors are usually located above or below the main production floors, and they house all those critical utilities, your HVAC systems, electrical systems, water purification, all the stuff that keeps everything running smoothly.
It's like the heart and lungs of the whole facility.
It's
amazing to realize just how much complexity is involved in something that most people probably never even think about. Like when you pick up a prescription at the pharmacy, you don't think about all this. But that's what I love about these deep dives. We get to uncover all the hidden intricacies and really appreciate all the work that goes into something as important as creating a life-saving drug.
I totally agree. It's about connecting all the dots, right? From the tiniest cells to the complex systems that support their journey to becoming medicine. It's pretty incredible when you think about it.
It really is. So to our listener who's now been on this whirlwind tour of a cutting-edge biologics facility, what would you say is the key takeaway here? What should they be thinking about if they were tasked with designing their own state-of-the-art facility?
I think the biggest thing is to keep the big picture in mind. We sweat all the small stuff, every pipe, every filter, every detail matters, but it's important never to lose sight of the ultimate goal, to create a facility that's not just safe and efficient, but adaptable and innovative as well, ready to take on whatever challenges tomorrow might bring in the world of medicine.
It's about pushing the boundaries, always striving to create better treatments for the people who need them most. Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive.
It has been a pleasure, as always.
To our listener, thank you so much for joining us on this journey into the world of biologics manufacturing. We hope you've enjoyed this deep dive, and until next time, stay curious.